The war was supposed to be contained. That was the promise. Strike hard, strike fast, cripple the core, and keep the fire from spreading. That was the image projected to the public. A disciplined campaign, controlled escalation, precision without drift. Iran would be hit. Its military machine would be degraded. Its network would panic. Its options would shrink. And Washington, from a position of strength, would dictate the rhythm of what came next. But wars do not unravel where press briefings say they will. They unravel at the edges. They slip through weak seams, exposed allies, overextended bases, crowded capitals, and political grey zones where power is shared by governments, militias, intelligence services, and men with rockets who do not need permission from anyone. And that is why what happened in Baghdad matters far more than one strike, one embassy compound, or one night of panic in the green zone. Because when a missile hits the US embassy in Baghdad in the middle of an already expanding war with Iran, the real message is not just that America can be targeted. The real message is that the war may already be larger than the one Washington said it was fighting. This is the part of modern war that official narratives always underplay. The opening blows are clean, the maps are simple, the objectives sound finite, the language is full of confidence. But then the secondary front appears. Then the retaliatory theatre opens. Then the battlefield stops being a line and starts becoming a network. And suddenly the question is no longer whether the first strikes worked. The question becomes whether those strikes triggered a wider strategic chain reaction that no one can fully control. Baghdad may be that chain reaction, because Baghdad is not just another city in the region. It is one of the most dangerous pressure points in the entire Middle East. It is where American power still sits physically exposed. It is where Iran's influence has been cultivated for years through militias, politics, patronage, and fear. It is where the Iraqi state tries to survive between rival centers of power without ever fully mastering them. And it is where any direct US-Iran conflict can mutate into something much uglier. A layered war of deniable attacks, local proxies, political paralysis, urban panic, and strategic attrition. If that sounds familiar, it should. Iraq has been this arena before, but what makes this moment more serious is timing. This strike did not happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of a broader confrontation. It landed while American officials were trying to project momentum. It landed as military reinforcements were moving into the region. It landed after warnings, evacuations, and security alerts had already signaled that US planners feared exactly this kind of blowback. In other words, the attack did not merely expose a vulnerability, it exposed a contradiction. The contradiction is brutal. If the war is under control, why is the American military reinforcing so aggressively? If deterrence is working, why are key US facilities still in the line of fire? If the enemy is being crushed, why does the battlefield keep expanding? Those questions matter because they reach beyond one embassy strike. They go to the heart of whether Washington is still shaping the conflict or merely reacting to its spillover. And in war, that difference is everything. A power that chooses escalation is dangerous. A power that is dragged into escalation is vulnerable. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to rewind for a second and look at the strategic architecture of the region. For years, the United States built its Middle East posture on a combination of direct presence and distributed exposure. Troops, advisors, embassies, logistics hubs, intelligence sites, air assets, naval platforms, regional partners, and diplomatic compounds formed a web. That web created reach. It also created targets. Iran, by contrast, built something different. Not symmetric power, not a clean empire. A shadow lattice. Militias, armed political factions, proxy relationships, ideological allies, local clients, regional corridors, and networks that could pressure America without always leaving fingerprints strong enough for instant retaliation. That asymmetry has always been one of the central realities of this confrontation. America can destroy military sites. Iran and its aligned networks can create strategic noise, bleed time, raise costs, fracture confidence, and open new fronts at lower levels of visibility. One side demonstrates dominance through force concentration. The other tests endurance through distributed disruption, and Iraq is where that model becomes most dangerous. Because Iraq is not fully neutral, not fully aligned, not fully sovereign in the way outside observers sometimes imagine. It is a state with institutions, yes, But it is also a country where armed actors beyond the full control of the central government have long mattered. It is a place where American presence is both official and politically combustible. It is a place where Iranian influence is real but not uncontested. It is a place where a single strike can be interpreted as retaliation, deterrence, symbolism, pressure, or opening move, sometimes all at once. So when a missile reaches the US Embassy compound in Baghdad, it does more than damage property or ignite fear. It punctures the illusion that the wider region can be sealed off while the main war runs elsewhere. It says, no, the rear is not secure. No, the perimeter is not stable. No, the conflict does not belong only to the front line you chose. That is why this story wins over so many others. Not because Baghdad is new to violence, it is not. Not because embassies are never threatened, they are. This story matters because of what it reveals in this exact moment. The war is beginning to express itself through a different geography, and once that happens, everything changes. The first change is military. A war that widens laterally forces dispersion. Instead of concentrating on one campaign, planners must defend multiple nodes. Air defense, force protection, personnel movement, intelligence warning, diplomatic security, convoy risk, evacuation contingencies, and regional coordination all become more urgent at once. That is costly in every sense. It costs assets. It costs attention. It costs momentum. It costs clarity. The glamorous image of offensive control starts to dissolve into the less glamorous reality of strategic management under pressure. The second change is political. Iraq's government is immediately trapped in a familiar nightmare. It cannot appear to be a passive host for attacks on the United States, especially on such symbolic sites, but it also cannot simply move as an extension of Washington's will, without inflaming domestic factions and armed groups that already view American presence as illegitimate or temporary. The result is paralysis dressed up as balancing. Statements are issued. Security is reviewed. Officials speak of sovereignty. But beneath the language is a far more serious problem. If Iraq becomes the arena for this war, Baghdad may not have the power to stop it. The third change is psychological. Wars are not sustained only by weapons. They are sustained by confidence. Confidence among soldiers, diplomats, contractors, allies, investors, and publics. When the embassy in a heavily fortified capital can be struck, the message travels. It reaches every American facility in the region. It reaches every allied government calculating risk. It reaches every militia commander looking for signs that pressure is working. It reaches every civilian employee wondering whether their compound is a fortress or a trap. And once confidence starts to crack, the effects can spread faster than the blasts themselves. This is where the official story and the real story start to separate. The official story says the central objective remains intact. The campaign is degrading the threat. Reinforcements are a sign of resolve. Security warnings are precautionary. America still holds escalation dominance. Perhaps that is the surface reading, but the real story may be darker. The real story may be that every major US strike on Iran increases the incentive for retaliation through deniable, indirect, politically messy theaters where Washington's overwhelming conventional strength is less decisive. The real story may be that Baghdad is not a side plot but a signal. Not the war's headline, but its future grammar. Instead of one clean theater, many pressure points. Instead of one front, several. Instead of one battle, one front, several. Instead of one battle map, a web of exposed American interests stretching from diplomatic compounds to regional bases. And that shift matters because great powers are often most uncomfortable in exactly these kinds of conflicts. They know how to punish, they know how to project force. What they struggle with is the war of cumulative friction, the war of recurring shocks, the war of strategic leakage. The enemy does not need to win conventionally. It only needs to prove that the conflict will keep spreading cost, fear, and instability faster than Washington can politically absorb it. That is what the Baghdad strike raises. Not certainty. Not proof of a grand coordinated campaign. But the possibility. And in geopolitics, possibility changes behaviour even before certainty arrives. Look at the timing of reinforcements. More Marines moving in. Additional military assets shifted toward the region. Defensive postures hardened. That is not the behaviour of a power preparing for a clean wrap-up. That is the behavior of a power preparing for wider contingency. And once military institutions prepare for contingency, political narratives of control start sounding thinner, because institutions respond to risk more honestly than press releases do. This is why the most revealing thing about moments like this is not the rhetoric after the strike. It is the posture before and after it. Warnings had already gone out. Personnel had already been told to restrict movement. Normal operations had already been curtailed. The danger was not theoretical, it was expected. That does not mean Washington caused the attack or wanted the attack. It means Washington knew the attack was plausible enough to prepare for, which leads to a grim conclusion. The risk of an Iraqi front was built into the war from the beginning, even if the public storyline emphasized something narrower. And once a secondary front is built into the logic of the conflict, it tends not to remain secondary for long, because every future incident now gets interpreted through this new lens. A rocket near a base? Not an isolated event, but another brick in a widening campaign. A militia statement, not noise, but positioning. A movement of American aircraft, not routine, but response. A speech from Tehran or a warning from Baghdad. Not diplomacy, but signaling under pressure. The whole ecosystem becomes more combustible. Small events start carrying larger meanings. That is how regional wars accelerate without a formal declaration of expansion. Not through one dramatic announcement, but through repeated incidents that train every side to expect the next one. And then there is the wider chessboard. If Iraq heats up, the entire regional alignment problem gets sharper. Gulf states become more anxious about exposure and entrapment. US partners begin asking whether support for Washington will draw retaliation toward their own infrastructure, bases, or cities. Shipping routes matter, yes, but so do air corridors, logistics chains, intelligence partnerships, and domestic public moods. If the conflict feels like it is metastasizing, even countries that broadly support US pressure on Iran may privately push for restraint, de-escalation, or distance. That is the hidden tax of a widening war. Even before the biggest military losses occur, diplomatic cohesion starts to erode, not necessarily in public, in private, through hedging, through delayed permissions, through more cautious language, through quiet fear that America's campaign objectives are evolving faster than Allied risk tolerance. Iraq itself becomes the most tragic example of this wider problem. It is a country still trying to live after years of invasion, insurgency, sectarian collapse, anti-terror war, corruption, militia power, and geopolitical tug-of-war. For ordinary Iraqis, the nightmare has never been only war. It has been being stuck between wars, between powers, between narratives, between armed men who all claim necessity. If Baghdad is again turned into a message board for US-Iran confrontation, the local population pays first in anxiety, disruption, and the return of that old poisonous feeling that their country is never allowed to belong fully to itself. And ordinary Americans should pay attention too, because this is where distant wars become longer wars. Once embassies are struck, compounds are locked down, forces are reinforced, and secondary theatres come alive, political leaders do not simply walk away without cost. They double down, recalibrate, or broaden mission language. Each option carries risk. Doubling down may deepen entanglement. Recalibration may look like weakness to hawks and provocation to enemies. Broadening the mission may turn a finite operation into an open-ended regional stabilization effort by another name. That is how wars stay alive long after their original justification starts fading. And that is why the question for ordinary people is not abstract. It is not just about maps and missiles. It is about whether this conflict is becoming one of those wars that reshapes budgets, deployments, alliances, domestic politics, and the emotional climate of the entire region for years. It is about whether the cost will now be measured not simply in strikes exchanged, but in a constant state of insecurity that bleeds into everything else. So where does this go from here? There are two plausible paths. The first is that this strike becomes a sharp but limited shock. Security is tightened. Iraqi authorities move to reduce further risk. Militia actors, having made a point, step back before triggering an overwhelming response. American reinforcements stabilize the theatre instead of inflaming it. The war remains dangerous, but the Iraqi front does not fully ignite. This is the best case reading. It preserves the idea that the strike was symbolic, not foundational. It allows Washington to claim that reinforcement restored deterrence. It gives every side room to avoid the next rung. But the second path is more ominous, and right now it may be the more revealing one. In that scenario, Baghdad is not the climax. It is the announcement, the first unmistakable sign that the conflict will no longer stay where officials prefer to describe it. More attacks follow, perhaps not all catastrophic, perhaps not all successful, but enough to maintain tension and force reaction. US positions in Iraq and maybe beyond face recurring pressure. Militias test thresholds. Washington responds selectively, then more forcefully. Iraq's leadership tries to contain the storm and finds it cannot. Every new incident deepens the sense that the region is slipping into a distributed war with no clean center and no easy off-ramp. If that happens, then the most dangerous development is not any single explosion, it is normalization. The normalization of being hit, the normalization of emergency posture, the normalization of open-ended retaliation. Once that becomes routine, leaders stop asking how to end the spiral and start asking only how to manage it. And that is when a war becomes truly hard to reverse. Because by then the logic has shifted. No side wants to appear weak. No side wants to absorb blows without answering. No side wants to grant the other the narrative of fear. That is how escalation stops being a choice and becomes a pattern. And this is why Baghdad matters so much right now. Not because it proves every worst-case theory, it does not. Not because all the facts are already known, they are not. There is still uncertainty around full attribution, full damage, and what comes next. But uncertainty does not reduce the danger here, it amplifies it. In a region already armed with suspicion, ideology, and strategic mistrust, uncertainty is fuel. It invites overreaction, rumour, factional freelancing, and decisions made under pressure. The strike on the US embassy in Baghdad may turn out to be one event in a short and ugly cycle, or it may be remembered as the moment the war revealed its true structure. Not one battlefield, but many. Not one enemy response, but a networked one. Not one campaign under control, but a conflict already slipping through the cracks of the order built to contain it. That is the darker implication. The official story says power is being projected with purpose. The emerging story suggests power is now being tested at every seam. The official story says the campaign is shaping the region. The emerging story suggests the region is shaping the campaign. And the official story says this is still manageable. Maybe it is. But history is full of moments that were called manageable right before they became defining failures of strategic imagination. Because wars are rarely lost at the centre first. They are lost when the edges keep catching fire. So now the real questions begin. If America is truly controlling this war, why does it keep needing to reinforce the places it said were secure? If Baghdad can be struck in the middle of this campaign, how many fronts are already active that the public has not fully reckoned with? And if Iraq becomes the pressure valve for this confrontation, who exactly is in control of escalation then?